Jesus went to the territory near the town of Caesarea Philippi, where he asked his disciples, "Who do people say the Son of Man is?" "Some say John the Baptist," they answered. "Others say Elijah, while others say Jeremiah or some other prophet." "What about you?" he asked them. "Who do you say I am?" Simon Peter answered, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." "Good for you, Simon, son of John," answered Jesus. "For this truth did not come to you from any human being, but it was given to you directly by my Father in heaven. And so I tell you, Peter, you are a rock, and on this rock foundation I will build my church, and not even death will ever be able to overcome it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. What you prohibit on earth will be prohibited in heaven, and what you permit on earth will be permitted in heaven." Then Jesus ordered his disciples not to tell anyone that he was the Messiah. So this passage from Matthew's Gospel, often summarized as the story of Caesarea Philippi, Jesus going to that place at the very extremity of the northern reaches of his ministry, and it is usually seen in gospel terms as a real tipping point in the ministry of Jesus, both in geographical terms but also in theological and personal terms. It is a major turning point in the ministry of Jesus. And in the gospel tradition, all the events leading up to this moment in the gospel seem in general terms to be about the growth of Jesus' ministry, growth in his popularity, also growth in the opposition to what he stands for, particularly, of course, from the Jewish authorities. And then leading from this passage in gospel terms, we definitely have that sense of now beginning that journey to the cross. And that, of course, is a story of increasing challenge to those who seek to follow Jesus, a growing isolation for Jesus, of course, ultimately in the cross, Jesus alone, and his disciples and his followers having deserted him. So here is this great tipping point in the account of Jesus' ministry. I noticed, looking at the passages that lead up to this one in Matthew's Gospel, there's a particular focus on the growing opposition from the group that Matthew describes as the Pharisees and the Sadducees, who are, of course, the two main leading groups of authorities in the time of Jesus. The Pharisees, more a lay movement. The Sadducees, of course, the more aristocratic group of leaders whose authority is centered around Jerusalem and the temple. And what it seems to me that Matthew is painting here is a picture of these authorities in combination, causing something of a blockage in the life of Israel. The story of God's goodness and God's grace, God's liberation for his people, has somehow got clogged up and blocked up in this combination of autocratic leadership. And I also note that the stories that Matthew tells in leading up to here, in terms of Jesus' ministry, are actually stories of abundance. We've got the two feeding miracles, the feeding of the 5,000 and then the feeding of the 4,000, with the emphasis on all those baskets, 12 and then 7 baskets of leftovers, that sense of God's goodness and God's grace being far more than sufficient for the people of Israel. And the story from last week's lectionary is the story of a Canaanite woman whose great claim to faith is an understanding that even the leftovers that fall from the table of the Lord are adequate to give her the sustenance that she needs. So there, on the one hand, are the Jewish authorities, those who bind and loose, those who say what does and what does not go, causing a blockage in the life of Israel. And there is Jesus' ministry bearing witness to the abundance of God's grace, which ought to know no such blockages. And I think that helps us to understand what is going on in the story of Caesarea Philippi. Taken alone, it might seem to be all about Peter as the special case, the one who's given a very special commission as the one who holds the keys to the kingdom, and the one on whom Jesus will build his church. And it's just worth pausing to reflect how unusual that word is, of course, in Matthew's Gospel, that Jesus should be using the word ecclesia, which really just means the congregation, the gathering of God's people. But of course, we hear as a description of the church that we now know. But I think taking all that together, we should maybe rather see Peter as the prototype, the archetype believer who understands God in Christ, who knows God in Christ, who knows Jesus as the Son of the living God. And there's something of a sort of bypass theology going on here, I think. For all those blockages caused by the authorities, here is a new kind of authority that is known by the believer, the one who understands who Jesus is, and who can bypass all of that blockage, all of that bottling up of the channels of God's grace. Peter is a special one, of course he is, in the story of Jesus' ministry, but I think he's also the prototype for all of us who would claim to know Christ, the Son of the living God. Those who can be channels of God's grace that is not bottled up or obstructed, but is actually allowed to flow freely and generously into the life of God's world. It is we who hold the keys of the kingdom. It is we, the gathered people of God, seeking in truth and in faith to understand God's grace. It is we who are the keepers of the kingdom.